Good morning, everyone. I hope you can hear me. Welcome to New York. Welcome to the Consul General, and thanks to the organizers for having some of us at least back again for India Day. We're here to talk over the next 40 minutes or so about, in some ways, setting the stage for what we've heard a little bit already on South-South cooperation, the role of India, lessons that can be applied and learned. And I have a really excellent panel here. You would have seen all of their bios, so I won't go into detail, but I'll just briefly introduce them. Daniel Seymour, Director of Strategic Partnerships at UN Women, to my far right. Gargi Ghosh, with the President for Global Policy at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, to my right. Udebe Das, formerly with the International Monetary Fund, IMF, now a colleague of mine at ORF America in Washington, D.C. And Odd Darnall, also based in Washington, who is with the Stimson Center, think tank there, focused on global South affairs. So what I thought I'd do, let me just start by asking each of our panelists a couple of questions, and maybe we'll have 10 minutes or so for questions from the audience as well. Let me start with Odd. We've been hearing a lot about the global South, particularly the last few years. It seems to have picked up. This is a term that has been contested, debated. Some people, even in the global South, have different views on it. And it's something that was used much more commonly in certain circles in history, in literature, and critical theory, but not really in international relations very much. Tell us a little bit about what is the global South, and what are some of the debates around it, maybe just to set the stage.
Thank you very much, Dhruva, and thank you for having me today. I will try to be as short as possible, because I think I could speak about this concept for days. I think that really the context that we are in, and we've seen it with the pandemic crisis of COVID-19, the war in Ukraine, now the war that we're seeing in Gaza. I think and obviously climate change, right? We're really living in an accumulation of crisis that has really highlighted the inequity, the global inequity that the international system has been sustaining over the past decades. And for many countries across the global South, really this sense of urgency, this sense of existential threats. When we talk about small island developing states, for instance, and really this concept of the global South as reappeared as this concept that truly highlights these challenges, right? To me, it's a concept that, although, as you mentioned, has been debated so many times and still is, I do believe that first it enables us to look at these countries not just as mere pounds for global powers, whether it is the United States, China, or else, not mere beneficiaries of aid, but really truly placing them back as agents, as active agents of the international system, with national interests, with national security interests, with their full agency, and as truly actors of, force of propositions, of proposals to reform the international system, so that we move from one that is inequitable, that doesn't truly allow prosperity for all, to one that is, that understands that the prosperity of the parts benefits to the prosperity of the entire system.
Udebe, you've written and worked a lot on, in many places in the global South, including in India and in Latin America, other places. What are some of the institutional constraints to further South-South cooperation? We talk about needing more of that, of a rebalance, and yet the results to date have been somewhat mixed.
If I can just go back on the global South, because that'll give a context on what I'm going to say. Whenever the term global South comes, I visualize this as a pyramid in which there are three tiers. There's the cone on which countries like India and a couple of other countries are sitting, largely emerging markets, some frontiers. You then have a middle crust of countries who have demonstrated some track record in some areas. And then comes the bottom tier, which is where the biggest problem of development, poverty, neglect, exclusion, etc. stands. Why do I raise this? Because I think it's important to sort of break this up, because then you'll see that uh, we can target a lot of our interventions appropriately. So I don't want everybody to start looking at a pyramid, but that's a nice way to structure. We are talking about almost 130 countries or more in this pyramid. The bottom tier is about 40, 45 countries. So what is common across all the three, whether it's the cone or the middle or the bottom? And this is very much based on my own experience of having lived in Global South, worked there for 30 years. Weak capacity, skill gaps, and low literacy rates. I think this is an institutional impediment which is coming in the way on any aspect, whether it's digital, technology, science, education. The second is somehow the inability, and I'm talking here about the bottom rung in the middle, inability to sustain or provide continuity to policy and project implementation. So they do it, but they can't sustain it. And that's sort of linked to the first one about, capacity and people, skills. The third is that they have adopted policy frameworks, I call them cheaply imported and poorly calibrated. And that's why the policy is not working. And policy working is important because that gives you the framework. And last, which is very critical, is an incomplete legal and institutional framework. So these four things drove whatever you may do, financial sector, social sector, they come up in one way or the other, and some of these interact with each other. So I don't know whether it really answers what you have in mind, but I think that's the framing that I have in response to your question. Yeah.
Daniel, from your perch at UN Women, and I want to underscore that whenever we talk about these issues, the development issues, 50%, roughly 50% are women, and yet I think, as the UN Secretary General pointed out yesterday or the day before, he said only 10% of speakers this UNGA were women. So there is we still have institutional inequities like that to overcome. But from your perch, in some ways you have different mandates. You have the short-term crisis management issues, including the several crises around the world, but you also have the long-term development objectives, sustainable development goals, and whatever follows that. How do you balance humanitarian objectives, from your perch with the longer-term development agenda?
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for the event, which is wonderful, and the opening speakers and the work. I think from our point of view, one of the most profound things the world is getting wrong in crisis response that allows us to bridge that development crisis continuum, and it is a continuum, of course, that just as I would argue the idea of a global south doesn't withstand close interrogation, the idea that there is crisis at one moment and suddenly you're at development somewhere else is absolutely, obviously, I think we all understand that. But one of the most profound things I think that we feel is forgotten in that context is women's empowerment as a part of crisis response, and as a part of achieving durable and sustainable peace and recovery post-crisis. It is very, very common, and I've done this myself, I'm sure a number of colleagues here have worked in crisis contexts, that if you sit with the traditional humanitarians, I had a number of years in organizations that would consider themselves to be very much part of the traditional humanitarian ecosystem, they will tell you that gender equality is something that comes after, that you start by saving lives, and then you move on to luxuries, if you like gender equality. Of course, the reality, again, if you ever worked in a crisis, you will know that women carry their communities on their shoulders from crisis to resilience. We know, for example, from research which we've done and worked together with our friends in UNFPA, that the benefit to cost ratio, there's a way you calculate, and obviously it's a degree of art rather than just science, but the benefit to cost ratio of investing $1 into services for women generates a median value of about $8. An investment of $1 into services or cash interventions targeting men generates vastly, vastly less. So what we really need is, as we look at crisis response, to understand that empowering women and investing in women is not just as we say, not just the right thing to do, it's a smart thing to do, and it's a quantifiably smart thing to do at a time when, certainly when we look at crises and the humanitarian needs in the world today, they vastly exceed not just available resources, but frankly, realistic resources. It is not going to be the case that the world will find the money to meet the various humanitarian appeals that we currently have. And I know as the UN, we should be saying, no, it's eminently achievable, but we know the reality of this. So we have to be in the business of very high return on investment interventions, and investing in women's empowerment is really one of the highest that we have, but that message has not yet really been integrated and understood in the context of our collective humanitarian response.
Garge, just bring you into the conversation as well. You work at the largest foundations in the world, very active presence across the global south, including in India. What are some of the lessons you have seen? We heard some of the opening speakers highlight a few of them, where India's experience is potentially replicable, or there can be and not just India's lessons, but there can be other opportunities for South-South lessons learned.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Well, just to start, the foundation began in Seattle about 25 years ago with a singular focus on health inequities. As Bill and Melinda Gates were starting the foundation, they traveled the world and were seeing children dying of diseases that were imminently preventable for pennies, dollars a dose. So at that time, we sort of divided the world. We were blissfully ignorant of geopolitics and politics. But for us, the division in the world was places where children were dying of diarrheal disease, of malnutrition, and places where they weren't. And where they weren't, we wanted countries like Norway and Canada to contribute to a global solidarity effort. And so institutions like Gavi were born, a global compact to vaccinate children. And countries where children were dying of those diseases, we really wanted to prioritize fixing those problems, whether that was by financing or policy measures or just government sort of signals. So that was the division for us. And over time, India actually has been at the forefront of a group of countries that have created a third category, and that is the sort of emerging powers who have both populations in poverty, where children are still not accessing health, education, nutrition sufficiently, but also increasingly the capability and the resources to manage that themselves. So it's been a super exciting third path for us, one where the prioritization is so obvious, is not subject to the economies of the advanced industrial world, and actually super productive from a solution perspective. So just to give you some examples, India, of course, now is the world's supplier of vaccines. It's the largest producer of vaccines that go to kids all around the world. Serum Institute is one of the organizations that do that. But even on the digital front in particular, for those of you who traveled to India soon after COVID, if you got vaccinated here, you showed up with your rickety little CDC card, and everyone in India laughed at you because they had their digital co-win certification, digital vaccine certification, that was used in many, many countries around the world. Great innovation, very simple. Another example that we're really excited about now is in digital financial inclusion and just digital economy. We all know for all countries, especially in the developing world, getting economies and people on the first rung of the ladder of digital connectivity then creates lots of new opportunity. India, of course, has Aadhaar, their domestic homegrown ID system, but actually we've been partnering with academic institutions, innovators in India to develop another ID, an open source ID platform, MOSIP, that is now used in, or its component parts are used in 20 countries around the world. So I think the ability to innovate in contexts makes the innovations much more useful, and we now are hopefully are part of a system of diffusing those innovations around the world.
I want to ask all four of you in different ways about some of the challenges. In some ways, again, what you've laid out are, there's grounds for optimism, there's ground for constructive cooperation. It makes sense, but what are some of the obstacles, I think, going forward? So maybe we'll start with Odd. What do you see as some of the major institutional and structural challenges to greater South-South cooperation?
Thank you. It's a great question. I think first, just want to emphasize that before going into the challenges, I think there's definitely value for that South-South cooperation because of what my colleagues here have just highlighted, but also to kind of move from this charity top-down approach that we know with the traditional system to that sovereign indigenous models and paradigms for development. So first, I do want to emphasize that. On the challenges, South-South cooperation is not new. It's been going on for decades. The current crisis are certainly motivating more of that South-South cooperation, but I do believe that there are ways where we could foster more of those exchanges at all levels. So from the the level of civil society scholars like myself, thinkers, to government level. For instance, how do we connect people in the Caribbean to India, where in certain contexts we have similar challenges, even though in terms of national context, geographies, and so on and so forth, we have very different contexts. However, we do find similar challenges, and so how do we connect thinkers, civil society organizations, grassroots movements in India to those in the Caribbean, to exchange on those lessons learned, to exchange on the paradigms for development, to exchange on models that have succeeded. This is one thing where I think that there is more room. And secondly, at the governmental level, I think we also need to acknowledge the fact that while we do have many good students in the South, we also need responsibility to be taken by governments to invest in that cooperation, not only to look at those lessons learned and how to adapt them, because it's not just about, it shouldn't be about simply exporting those, because as Udaibir has mentioned, there has been very cheap import of policies. So the idea is not to reproduce the same thing with South-South cooperation. It is about adapting the lessons learned. It is about really seeing how they can fit in the context elsewhere. But it is also at the governmental level, investing in that. For instance, I have colleagues in Senegal. They call themselves, so they're social entrepreneurs, right? They work towards social transformation, and they created this collective of volunteers in Senegal where several social entrepreneurs with their different organizations came together to create this platform, this social hub where provides capacity building to smaller organizations and grassroots movements, that provide capacity in funding raising, right, in sustainability, in monitoring and evaluation. And they've been doing this by themselves for a few years on their self-funding, and they've been telling me about their difficulty to receive funding, not simply from foreign donors and traditional donors, but also from their own governments. And I think that, this issue of leveraging stakeholders within countries, right? So governments, but also the private sector, the philanthropy is one where I think that there is more room, there is more efforts that needs to be done. Because again, as much as I in my daily work, I advocate for reform of the traditional system, at the same time, we need to acknowledge that we cannot wait for the system to be reformed. We cannot wait for the system to be transformed. And so we need to seize ourselves all the opportunities, all the avenues, all the solutions that exist and invest in them. And that also goes, as we talk about South-South cooperation, obviously an important component is global South governments investing in their, vibrant civil society, vibrant businesses, small, medium, and larger scale. And as I agree with Udaibir about that systemic lack of capacities that we see, I also want to deconstruct this idea that there is no innovation, because and I worked in the international assistance before coming into policy, and that was one of the regular trope on donors' side, which is there's no capacity, there are no skills, but there are. When from Guinea, I worked in Guinea, Senegal, Nigeria, Cameroon, there is innovation. You have plenty of civil society organizations, of social entrepreneurs that do the job. They are on the front line of sovereign and sustainable development. But they need support, they need funding, they need, when it needs the case, right, they need capacity building. But I think it is truly important that we shift away from simply cheaply importing models to value what we have. And that goes through decolonizing the way we understand knowledge production, the way we understand what is an efficient stakeholder for development, and truly looking at what we have and nurturing it and supporting it with the local philanthropy, with the local private sector, with the government, and with that South-South cooperation.
Olivia, if I can ask you a little bit, just building off that point, particularly institutions, international institutions, where, we heard a lot of talk about the need to reform some of them. We've had some parallel institutions being built up, including financial institutions, development institutions. Where do you see the main obstacles to such change?
Well, that's a very fine question and a very leading one. I think that is exactly what people are saying needs to be reformed, because there is a very large shareholder and there are allies of that large shareholder. And these are two organizations that work on the basis of IMF on quotas, and at the bank you have a similar, voting on different proposals. I mean, I think the way I look at this is that it's been now 80 years, Dhruv, 1944, when policymakers met in Bretton Woods after the World War. And by that time, the 350-year-old Adam Smith's philosophy of capitalism was rife in their minds. And what came out 80 years back was very much trying to take and create the architecture that is going to promote that view, which later on, the neoliberals came in and so on and so forth. Rest is history. Why am I saying that? Because I think it is important to see where we are, why are we where we are. And why is it that the reform of the international monetary system, which, by the way, the G20 has a group and all kinds of reports have come out on this, is just not moving. It's just not moving. I mean, the IMF quota review that took place a couple of months back just came out dud. Nobody had any willingness to give any more money. The same thing is happening at the bank. The bank is not getting it, World Bank, or the development banks, they're not getting any additional money, but they've been told to sort of, scrap at the bottom of the barrel internally in trying to realign the balance sheets and see where they can bring out efficiencies. I think this is where, and going back to this importing policy issue, I've always believed that policies have to be proportional to countries. In my sort of pyramid, you just cannot have policies for the bottom tier akin to what they are for the cone. And that is somehow something that is not really happening. There's a lot of lip service, tailor it to the country, mindful of capacity constraints, so don't calibrate it too hard. Reality is, it doesn't happen. So how do you bring the change about in these institutions? Some people argue that the governance should be different. I don't know whether that'll be the case ever. What is the biggest problem, I think, in the reform is money. All these ideas, thanks to Gargi, what she does, philanthropics are the new entrants into this game of funding and financing. They were not there in the manner that Gates Foundation brought that, and now that's a new place to go for money. Why? Because you just don't have an inbuilt capacity anymore. And frankly, the development of the future cannot be unfunded. Let's be clear about it. I understand your point that it'll never be a perfect world, but there cannot be unfunded mandates given to development. We have to stop that, because that's creating other kinds of problems. There is a big issue, my last point, that where does the money and resources come from? And can India catalyze that in some way? Can the Global South come together and harvest their own, whatever they have? Let me tell you that Global South has financial assets and non-financial assets. It's just that they don't recognize it and they don't give monetary value to it. So there are a number of ways in which you can cut this, rather than just go to the United States as the biggest shareholder and say, give me more money. So to close, funding, financing is the biggest thing. And therefore, just to close this thing, one of the biggest drawbacks in development theories and development experiment of the next, whether you call it NDGs or whatever, is going to be the global financial safety net, which you need. You need a backstop. Something could go wrong tomorrow. It could go wrong in digital, it could go wrong in technology, it could go wrong in women. You need a safety net, you need a backstop. We don't have a fully funded backstop at the moment at global level. Now, can South come in and call for it? I hope they do.
Daniel, you made a very compelling case for, practical reasons where, support for women goes farther. Why doesn't it happen some more? More if we would be seeing a lot more of it.
Thank you. If you'll forgive me, I just want to build a little bit on what Uda said. I think it's an extremely important point to take away from discussions like these, particularly in this framing of the next development agenda. If there's one thing I've learned in my current role, it's that the misalignment of financing, by which I don't just mean the amount of money, but the type of money and the way the money works, with development objectives, is an endemic weakness across our development system and efforts. And while we may have different views on where you calibrate between ambition and pragmatism, I think your point is absolutely crucial, so thank you. Maybe just in that context then of the challenges, what's stopping us, particularly and you framed originally in the context of South-South cooperation. And of course, every challenge I like to think is an opportunity, so maybe I can offer three. The first is, of course, we do have global frameworks, such as, of course, the Sustainable Development Goals, which are accompanied by indicators and targets that are very tangible and concrete. Frameworks coming out of the very successful Indian presidency of the G20. And next year, we will see the 30th anniversary of the Beijing Platform for Action. All of these offer us a kind of vocabulary and orientation that allows us to compare what we are doing across different contexts. And that facilitates exchange of ideas on gender equality, on all sorts of areas, not just South-South, but South-North, North-South, triangular, etc. So I think if we can do a better, the challenge is we're not yet really embracing those frameworks as the vocabulary of those development efforts on gender and in other areas. And if we were to do so, it would enhance, I think, the ability to share across different contexts. Second, and relating to that, is we do have, I think, on gender, I'm not qualified to say how much it's the case for other areas, but I suspect it may be, somewhat a paucity of the kind of data we need. And Gagi and the foundation have been, very, very important leaders in this area. But essentially, of course, you need to disaggregate data if you are to demonstrate the impacts of different policy choices or innovations or programs such that they might be replicated or used. But it's not just disaggregation, and this is where I think we have to recognize that extra mile, because if you don't then look at that disaggregation between male, female against other criteria, you can miss very important things. Let me just give you one example. If you don't take data on educational attainment, obviously and disaggregate it male, female, you miss a lot. But if you don't then interrogate it against income, you miss other things too, right? So on the whole, in the majority of countries, girls in rich households are a little bit more likely than boys to complete tertiary. And in most countries, girls in the bottom, in poor households, the bottom income quintile, are less likely than boys to even get to tertiary in the first place. So you need to interrogate a little more than just male-female. You need to kind of cross-reference it against a couple of other things. And the last thing, and Ud, I'm pronouncing your name right? Yes. Yeah, thank you. Ud, I think you're absolutely right. It is very easy to fool ourselves because certainly people, such as me in the UN, because we work with governments primarily, there are our shareholders, if you like. But the private sector is enormously determining of the reality of the lives of women and girls and others. And I think there is a great opportunity for us to find ways to look at the replicable experience, both of regulation of the private sector, of course, in my area of work with hiring practices, maternity leave, parental leave, and so on. Also the enabling environment for business, including in terms of investment regimes, and the practices of business itself. And that again also requires, business runs on data. Businesses are all about their metrics and numbers. So identifying ways as well that you can look at that, and that's some of the things that we do as UN Women. So I'd say those three probably are front of mind. There's many, but those are the things I pretty focus on. Thank you.
Gary, from the point of view of the Gates Foundation, what are some of the challenges you see now to working on the ground? I mean, again, we heard earlier, there's been a slowdown, at least in some of the SDG objectives, particularly with the pandemic and other crises. Where do you see the major challenges for you?
Yeah, thank you. It's been a very tough few years for all countries, and I think what we're finding now is all around the world, governments are having to make very difficult decisions about what to prioritize, where to spend their money. In Africa, that is overlaid with a huge debt burden. So many governments in Africa are spending more on debt servicing than on health and education. And so that's sort of upside down for how you want to restart growth. So it's a very, very tough environment. But within that, I think the sort of points of light, we care deeply about this, so we're very happy to see more of a focus on investing in the health of people, in human capital, as a deep understanding that that is the beginning of peaceful, prosperous, resilient societies. So that's great. And understanding that digital infrastructure is part of the new growth infrastructure. I think that's creates new job opportunities, new income-generating opportunities around the world. And I would just close by sort of violently agreeing with my panel mates here that some of what we need to do more is invest in that South-South knowledge transfer. I mean this in a literal way more than a metaphorical way, but the institutions and the flows now run through New York and DC and London, and so there is a orientation to how that knowledge flows. We work very closely with the G20 instruments. We try to work with ASEAN. They are, even with very strong leadership, India, Brazil, they're not capacitated to be standing transfers of information. There is no secretariat that survives across presidencies at the G20. The Asian Development Bank, I think, is a really exciting, most of the regional development banks are a really exciting point of light to be able to take what's working in one part of the world and transfer it to a similar context. So I think there's reason to be very optimistic, but it will take some persistence to kind of keep development progress going at the pace all of our populations want in a very tough fiscal environment.
I'm conscious of time and some of our speakers have other commitments, but I think we have time for 2 or 3 very quick questions. So maybe, lady here and then.
So basically, here's the real, we all real my name is Seema Chaturvedi. I run a venture equity fund investing in gender and political climate action. Yes, it is a reality that we have shortage of capital for thicker numbers, 5 to 7 trillion per year. In that setting, there are 2 things that can happen that will actually help us move the needle. Number 1, pick a domino in those 17 SDGs that will knock out, through a multiplier effect, all the other SDGs. Number 5 is a critical one. The role of philanthropy really is, can we stretch that dollar extensively? I would say the solution doesn't lie only in philanthropy. The solution lies in the private sector. So for the trillions that philanthropy has done a brilliant job with, and again, thanks Gates Foundation for leading with example, the private sector can do a lot more if we can show them the business case which truly actually exists. And we're not, so my request is, can philanthropy step in and help stretch the dollars of enablers such as myself to get in there and catalyze private sector capital by not even actually giving me $1, just by standing behind me and saying, I've got her back, I cover the risk, I'm underwriting the risk, which actually is a perceived risk, not a real risk. I have made money for people, I'll continue making money for people. My point here is, leading to the second point, 1, please think of other ways, in addition to grants, say blended finance, as a way to underwrite additional philanthropic capital and catalyzing capital, and second, back female fund managers. The multiplier effect of 8 is more than multiple fold made possible by people like us who are stretching and not only in the trenches but digging the trenches to make it all happen.
Thank you. Srinivasan?
Okay, this is a follow-up to what Seema has been saying. For the last 10 years, India has what is popularly called the 2% CSR Act, which mandates the private sector to actually to provide 2% of their profits for philanthropic activities of their choice. There is a broad guideline that the government provides. You think it will work across the global north as well if such a mandate were to be made? Would it be
Okay. Let's just do one more question, maybe from this side of the room.
Excellent panel. My question is, which is the low-hanging fruit where all of you are coming together and we just apply common sense and we utilize the intelligence of the next generation and the digital and the women and the fact that the world has changed post-COVID and there's a lot that can be done disruptively. I'm from private sector, and much rather than looking at the problems in isolation, where is that as convergence we can find a solution? Thanks.
Do you want to?
So very, very quickly, I think the most inefficient agent in mishandling money is the government, is the state. So don't think that, private philanthropy has to come in. If you want to put pressure, please put pressure on governments. They can do better financial management, they can broaden the tax base, they can bring about thousands of efficiencies that they do not. All they do is they go and want more money so that it can be mismanaged. We have seen innumerable cases, well documented, that state, i.e. the government, i.e. the public side, has to go a long, long way before they are coming. And this is a complaint that I hear between the donors and senior people that, listen, we know our calculations are you have enough in your system that you can bring to the table or you can increase tax base. So just as you're thinking through, which I'm sure Gargi will respond, whether philanthropy should backstop private sector, there is this issue. I would like to see public sector become much more astute in managing its resources and balance sheet, number one. The second on this, will private sector ever come in? There are two sterling examples at the moment where this is just not working. On climate finance, somebody mentioned that earlier on, the IMF came with a window, they put some modest amount on the table. The countries can take it, and on that every unit of dollar, I'm simplifying it, the private sector will come in and it helped to leverage that dollar. It's been 3 years and there have been no takers. Governments have taken that money, 6, 7 governments have taken, but when you go and ask them to what extent have they succeeded, because this is money coming from the International Monetary Fund, it's not even commercial money, it's somebody dipping in the safety net. The private sector has not come. And the second is work that I'm doing for Dhruv on sustainable finance. And that story is also coming out appalling. Sustainable finance raising right now is involving the private sector, but we see, at least I see very little data that is telling me that that money is actually going to the countries where the deficit is. It is still getting raised, issued, and circulated within the advanced markets or the mature markets. So I think that's, some people say it's an incentive problem, some people say I don't want to take the risk, some people say the premium goes up. Finance people in the room will come up with hundreds of ideas. But I just wanted to say, I think on the private sector side, we should keep on pushing, keep on pushing. They're trying to respond, but I don't think you will find anything magical coming out. Government, on the other hand, can actually, if they want, they can put the house to order.
Yes, great questions. Maybe just to start on the private sector, I mean, we're sort of obsessed with trying to be catalytic and not crowd out other sources of finance. Public sector is a great example where we try very hard to be thoughtful about are we replacing what should be done by the government in terms of delivering education or health programs, because that's a terrible thing for all the obvious reasons. On the private sector, I'll say we honestly haven't had a huge amount of success in doing that yet. We have the ability to take a variety of de-risking positions, first loss, guarantees. The private capital has not been as forthcoming. Very often we find what we're de-risking is development finance capital, and that annoys me very much because that is public sector money for development. But the actual private capital is a step away. Where I think we can do better is being a bit more savvy and understanding that different sectors have different opportunities for capital to come in. So it may not be worth our time talking about private capital in the primary healthcare space, but it may be very worth our time thinking about it in the financial inclusion or the agro-processing space. And so the development sector needs to get a little bit more finance savvy in targeting certain kinds of money for certain purposes. I think that is the place I'm optimistic about. And then just on the question about where things come together, I mean, we've had a lot of learning on that because even in our own organization, we have operated vertically. How do you deal with malaria? How do you deal with literacy? How do you deal with X? And it took us a while to really confront the fact that, we're trying to reach the same family or the same girl with all of these interventions. And so, this week in this town, we're talking about aggregate numbers and, we must make progress on antimicrobial resistance and we must make progress on TB. But the best part of my work now is actually making sure as an organization we're understanding what's going on in that family and how we bring our services together to reach that individual. So I think that is where you should expect the community to achieve a higher bar.
Daniel, any responses to anything?
Attempting to try and answer all three, but I know that we're limited, so maybe just to focus on a couple. First, if you'll allow something a little bit left field, but the low-hanging fruit is the question. And I think, we are feeling very much as UN Women, and I think the opening speaker raised this as well. We are very off track for the SDGs. We just have to be realistic about that. But what that means is that we have to be in the business of precisely low-hanging fruit, or the highest return on investment, best accelerators right now, not try and do everything, but do what will deliver most first. I do want to put on the table here, we very much feel as UN Women, and I will be in India in a few weeks, and this is one of the things I'll be talking to partners about. There is an enormous, very rapid dividend that can be achieved through focusing on care. The reality is that the unequal sharing of the burden of care robs us of economic participation of women to an enormous degree, and that's extraordinarily expensive. The opportunity cost of that is very, very high. When particularly governments invest, but also through collaboration with private sector and others, in provision of care services, it creates the care jobs themselves, which is an economic stimulus. Plus, we liberate those women to enter mainly women to enter the labor force. And so we think that's a quick win. It makes a ton of sense, and we have to actually talk about that a little bit more. And then let me relate that to Seema's point. And of course, I love what you said, of course. Interestingly, for those of us who've been around, you may remember the various iterations of efforts to cost development goals. I remember Professor Sachs and the costing of the MDGs. And of course, you have two problems. One is when you do it goal by goal, you miss synergies across the goals. And two, when you add up the bill for each goal, it's more money than you've got many times over. So you're absolutely in the business of finding those things that start the dominoes, the cross-cutting. And of course, gender equality consistently, demonstrably, and from evidence is clearly one of those things, care and whatever else. But that point that you make about we need to show the private sector the benefits of these development interventions. We just recently did. Let me just give you an example. We have a private sector vehicle, if you like, as UN Women, for the marketing and communications industry. And of course, we know whether it's the work or violence, a lot of these things are attitudinally driven, right? And the advertising industry is a bunch of people who try to change your mind. That's what they do. They try and make you make different purchasing decisions. So, of course, their adverts can promote or undermine stereotypes and negative views. But what you really want to show is that doing advertising that promotes gender equality, that promotes diversity and inclusion, is good for sales. And that's very, very difficult to do because the last thing companies want to do is share their sales data. It's very, very proprietary. It's very important for them in terms of competition. But we were able to get big companies, Unilever, Diageo, Mars, Bayer, to share that data and to cross-reference it against their advertising campaigns. And what we found with the Oxford University, the study we did, those advertising campaigns that are more inclusive generated a 3.5% immediate sales lift and a 16.25% over 1 to 2 years. That kind of information is gold for generating change in the private sector. So that's also something that we can all do. So thank you.
I'm conscious that our time is up, but I want to give Odd 30 seconds to respond to any one question.
Thank you very much, Dhruva. Perhaps, on the point on convergence is, I think we're saying convergence, right? We all agree that the SDG, we failed, right? We failed truly at achieving those SDGs. But I think there's convergence on this point. Perhaps one last question that I will leave with all of you is, the role of governments. How do we push for that collective action to actually take place? I think governments, as much as civil society organizations, scholars, we can provide all the offerings and recommendations as we can, but we need governments to take action. We need to find ways to build on that South-South cooperation, solidarity, and most importantly, that collective action, whether it is to reform the system, whether it is to strengthen alternative models. So that's my final point.
Please join me in thanking the panel, and we'll turn to the next one.